Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another session of the Lontar Literary Festival, held in collaboration with the Jakarta Content Week and under the auspices of the Indonesian Ministry of Education and Culture. I am Yuli Ismartono from the Lontar Foundation. This session will be the first conducted in English, and it promises to be an interesting one because we will look into literature on Indonesia and by non-Indonesians. The three panelists today have written books that are set in Indonesia. The questions that we will ask them will be, why write about Indonesia? When? How? Have they lived here or studied here? What interests them about the culture, the people, or perhaps the quirky, unpredictable politics? Well, we will listen to their views, and I promise it will be an engaging discussion. So allow me to introduce them to you. Our panelists today, Michael Vaticiotis, Jennifer Mackenzie, and George Quinn. As I call your name, please wave to the audience so you will be rightfully recognized. I will start with Michael. Michael, are you there? There you go.
Selamat pagi.
I tease him that he has gone from fact to fiction and now a conflict resolver. He started out as a journalist covering all kinds of news in Southeast Asia, but the creative juices in him led him to fiction, also nonfiction. Then he moved to conflict resolution, a much needed field in these challenging times. His works include Indonesian Politics under Suharto, Blood and Silk, Power and Conflict in Modern Southeast Asia, and The Painter of Lost Souls, published by Lontar. So, Michael, I think what we'd like to hear from you is, let me see, what first compelled you to write about Indonesia? Its people
Thank you, Yuli.
and culture, what? Was it purely academic, or was there a personal attraction that prodded you to write it down in writing?
Thank you, Yuli. It's good to be here, and thank you for inviting me to join today, the Lontar Lit Fest. I have known Lontar almost as long as I've known Indonesia, because I met John McGlynn in one of my first few weeks in Indonesia in 1987. I think to answer your question, I have to reach back quite far in time to when I was an undergraduate at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. And I was asked in my sort of second year to write an undergraduate thesis, which is not a very long piece of work. But the subject I chose was Sukarno. I was doing modern Southeast Asian history. I was being taught by Professor Merle Ricklifs, and I was drawn to the idea of profiling a personality, a key personality in Indonesia. And it was really that moment in time that I'd begun to discover the charming and fascinating history of Indonesia. And much later, as a journalist, I came to Indonesia as a foreign correspondent for the BBC. And very soon I realized that, covering Indonesia as a journalist, a foreign journalist, didn't really give me the full scope to express myself. I mean, apart from anything else in those days in the mid-1980s, it was quite difficult to say or write what you really saw was going on or thought was going on in the country. There were very strict constraints on what you could say or what you could write. I was a broadcast journalist for the BBC at the time. And so it's really for that reason that I started writing nonfiction initially. I wrote a book about a biography of Suharto in 1991. But eventually I turned to fiction because even the academic writing on Indonesia, I felt constrained. I felt that I couldn't really express what I thought about Indonesia, current affairs, its relationship to the culture and society that was evolving in the 1980s and early 1990s. And so eventually I turned to fiction, and I wrote some short stories, a collection of short stories on Southeast Asia initially, that many of them were set in Indonesia at that sort of very interesting period in the late 1990s, the Reformasi period, and the emergence of student movements. And I started to put myself in the frame of mind of some of the participants in those fascinating and important events of the late 1990s. And I wrote short stories about the emerging social and political trends of the Reformasi era. And that led me in turn to start to think of the big themes in Indonesia that I was interested in, about religion and ethnicity. And that's what led me to write my first novel, The Spice Garden, which was set in Ambon and Maluku, in the turbulent ethnic conflict that followed on from the Reformasi period in 1998. And it revolved around two characters, a Catholic priest and a Muslim trader. And it's no secret that this was loosely based on the story of the late great Des Alwi in his efforts to bring religious harmony to Maluku through the ownership of his hotel in Banda. And it was, loosely based on those events of that period around him that I wrote this novel. And then not many years later, I started to think of a novel set in Central Java, which was the part of Indonesia that I loved the most, I think, in terms of its sheer grace and beauty, complexity, but also a degree of simplicity of expression. I think one of the things I loved about Central Javanese culture, because I don't speak Javanese, is actually the way in which the Central Javanese speak Indonesia, the bahasa Indonesia, in a much slower and more, I feel, expressive way, even though for many of them it's their second language. And I was drawn to that. And I wanted to explore the whole issue of religious diversity and the threat to pluralism posed by the greatest, I think, social development in Indonesia. Perhaps George Quinn will have comments on this as well, which has been the gradual imposition and also increase of religious piety on Indonesian society, which has had a tremendous social and political impact. And I wrote a novel called The Painter of Lost Souls, which was set in Central Java and also married my interest in the arts to these political and social developments, because the story is about a young painter from Jogja, from Central Java, who comes to Jogja and immediately becomes, rather quickly becomes an overnight success in the way that many young artists in Central Java have done during the period of the last 15 or 20 years, using painting as a medium to express their feelings. And so the story is about this young painter. It's a coming of age story, but it's also set in very turbulent times. So I think that sort of describes my transition from journalism to academic writing to expressing myself through fiction in Indonesia. I'll say one last thing, which is that, for me, of course, one of the great attractions of Indonesia has been its blending of this rather sort of complex and historically evolved Hinduistic and Muslim society with all the sort of elements of the Pacific and the Malay Peninsula and Hindu Buddhist culture, with a sort of more modern, and I consider Islam in many ways a rather modern religion, going back to the 8th century, with the imposition of Dutch influence, but before that also Portuguese influence, which has created this blend of cultures that is rather familiar to someone like myself, who comes from originally a family that was born in the Middle East. I grew up in that sort of Levantine cultural milieu. And therefore many aspects of Indonesian culture were very familiar to me. The very fact that unlike in many parts of mainland Southeast Asia, people shake hands, people embrace. It's a very familiar cultural context for me, and something that I was very drawn to, given that I was rather dislocated from my own origins, grew up in the UK, a very sort of cold and distant culture that I didn't really have much in common with. And so when I came to Indonesia, I felt an immediate bond with the melange of cultures that constitute Indonesian identity. And it's something that I've always been very affectionate towards, and I've always been drawn to, and I'm usually very optimistic about. And so for me, Indonesia is a place that I reserve a great deal of affection for. I hope that captures it, Yuli.
You have indeed. I will though ask about your political book, which is Blood and Silk, although that's about Southeast Asia, but you do have a prominent section on Indonesia. You are also attracted to the politics of Indonesia.
It's always been a fascination to me, the colorful politics of Indonesia. But if I could dwell perhaps on some of the negative aspects that have fascinated me, I mean, it is essentially a personality-led political culture. It has increasingly become affected by what the old Indonesian scholars would call the aliran effect, you know, the extent to which people's identity, particularly religious identity, has once again begun to divide the country. You know, I covered the elections last year in Indonesia, and I was quite shocked in the end by the result, not so much in terms of who won the eventual contest, which was more or less predictable. But when I looked at the map, the electoral map that emerged after last year's election, it really began to look very much like the map of Indonesia in the mid-1950s, you know, with the polarization between elements of Indonesian society that are in many ways pluralistic, as people would like to say, and parts of Indonesia that hold very closely to tenets of Islam in a more exclusive way. And I think that's a very risky and dangerous aspect of Indonesian politics today. You were subject to, just a few days ago, the return from Saudi Arabia of Habib Rizik Shihab, who commands, you know, millions of voters in and around Jakarta and West Java, because of the way in which that they were able to whip up sentiment for this rather conservative firebrand version of Islam, captured by the Front Pembela Islam. And you know, I think what's interesting for me is that I've yet to see an ability to escape that capture by identity politics in Indonesia. And I don't see personalities who are able to rise above that. And that, to me, is a big risk for the future.
Great. We have questions from the audience, I believe. Are there questions from the audience for Michael? Dari siapa ya? Questions? From, I see a name there. Tidak ada, belum ada? Mungkin nanti bisa menyusul. We can follow up the questions later when they appear. Next, I would like to introduce Jennifer Mackenzie, with whom I have the pleasure of meeting for the first time. Jennifer.
Yes, lovely to meet you, Yuli. And thank you for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here.
Most welcome. She is described as a writer and poet who focuses on social, cultural dynamics in Indonesia and other Asian countries. She is the author of a book-length poem titled Borobudur, republished as, by Lontar no less, Borobudur and Other Poems. And another recent collection titled Navigable Ink,
Yes.
which is dedicated to Pramudia Anantatur,
Yes.
correct? So,
Yes, that's right.
Jennifer, an entire book on poems with a title like Borobudur. Wadu, so unique, at least for a journal like myself. Tell us what inspired you to do this. Was it this Hindu Buddhism mystique? Who was your muse?
Yes, well, the first time I came to Indonesia was way, way back in 1975. And it was my first trip to Indonesia. And I had a very strange experience. But when I came to Jakarta, I felt this intense feeling of familiarity. It was almost like a deja vu experience, I suppose you'd say. And as the time went on, that feeling has never really left me. And I think it's connected in a way to a couple of images in my poetry ongoing, which is images of carved stone, and also about the transformational power of dance. And so within Javanese culture, both things are expressed in such an intense and beautiful way that I was completely captivated by that. And there wasn't a kind of immediate response so much to that visit, but a few years later I was very fortunate to receive a couple of travelling scholarships. And so I returned a number of times initially I thought I would do some poems about what I was seeing, kind of reportage, I suppose. But as time went on, I realised that this wasn't good enough. I really needed to know more. And it took me probably a couple of years to get to the point where I chose Borobudur as the topic. I think partly because of the kind of poetic interests I have, as I just mentioned. And I really wanted to know more about this temple. And so I made the decision to put the poem in the voice of the architect, and that led to many, many years of research into that topic and the whole history of Asia around 8th, 9th century as well. And it was kind of plotting an imagined biography of the architect. And I should mention too that a lot of things came together. For example, as well as the research, I came across old Javanese literature for the first time and absolutely fell in love with its beauty, in translation, I should add. And so I think this long poem is a mix of inspiration, which is kind of poetic, kind of my own experience of being in Java, and this research. I thought maybe I could read a very short piece from Borobudur to give you a sense of what I mean by these kind of interactions. This is called We Moved Only at Night. We moved only at night, fearing the sun would illuminate us, like richly decorated paintings in a dark hall. We fell into the shadow of caves, behind large leaf trees. One night we stumbled down a path, marked with white stones, and fell onto the soft powdered sand with a volcanic floor. We walked silently, quickly, as mauve shadows took on the form of small hills. A yellow light made a slow appearance in the east. We climbed the steep cliff hurriedly, its jagged promenade should have warned us, for a huge smouldering crater lay beneath us. Sun and gas enveloped us in golden light. We picked our way along the rim, slippery from recent rain. The descent was easier. At the bottom, we stared into the blank faces of two shepherds. They spoke in a tongue opaque to both of us, but gestured to a path, to a direction. So in that piece, there's kind of connections with one of the Kakawan. I don't have the reference right now, but also with my experience of travelling to Mount Bromo, so that there's kind of, I hope, an immediacy that I've been trying to get with the imagery as well. So that's kind of the background to Borobudur. And after that, I did actually sign up for a master's degree in which I wrote a thesis on Premudia's Aris Barlick. And so I'll just show you, this is the new book, which is just out this year, with my local publisher, Transit Lounge. And so this combines a number of things. There's some poems which are based on some of the translation I did of Aris Barlick. Other sections relate to Premudia's life, and a lot of the themes in his work, the kind of historical perspective that he brings to his writing, and a few more contemporary pieces that kind of look to his idea of what is experienced before and presently has a kind of voice for the future. So that's basically been a very long engagement. This new book came after many years of work. It was rather a surprise, actually, when I actually got to the point of working on it. So I think that's more or less a summary of what I've been doing within poetry.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. I am curious, both you and George, who will be speaking later, tend to be Java-centric. Would you be in any way attracted to or look into the other parts of Indonesia, its culture, its literature?
Yes, in this book there are some poems that are not set in Java, but yes, I've actually thought I'd like to, maybe not a whole book, but I'd like to do some poems about Eastern Indonesia. And it requires some travel, so we'll just have to wait on that opportunity. But yes, I would like to expand on that.
Thank you. And I will now, if there are no questions I don't see in my thing, I would like to introduce Professor George Quinn, whom I also am meeting for the first time. Nice to meet you, George. His bio is impressive. Honorary professor, Java expert, and translator based at the Australian National University in Canberra. His translations include The Rape of Sukrani by A.A. Nyoman Panditisna, and his self-authored work includes The Novel is Javanese. And as you can see, I don't know if you can see, but I have a copy here of his book, Bandit Saints of Java. And he is currently completing an anthology of contemporary short stories translated from Javanese into English. George, your passion for anything Javanese is amazing. Why that interest, and how did it begin? Javanese culture is one of the oldest in the world. Do you see traditional Javanese culture being diluted with modernity, with the fast-paced development on technology that we see right now? Can you explain?
Yes, thank you, Yuli. Thank you for the opportunity to join you this morning. In fact, my interest in Javanese society began next door in Bali. I first came to Indonesia, would you believe, in January 1966, on the 4th of January. Indonesia was in a state of chaos at the time, and that was just a few months after the attempted coup of 1965. And in the course of that first visit to Indonesia, I paid a visit to Bali. Bali was almost empty at the time, empty of tourists. I stayed at the Dutch Bali Hotel in Jalan Veteran in the center of Denpasar. It was almost completely empty. And one of my Indonesian friends invited me to go to a theatrical performance of a new genre that was developing in Bali called drama gong. And we went to this performance in the villages not far from Denpasar. And when we got there, I found that the stage had been made by putting strips of bamboo on the grass of a football field and forming a kind of square. And the audience was all around the square on three sides. There was just a curtain at the back, and there was a little gamelan on one side. It actually reminded me very much of the kind of theatrical situation that we would have seen in Tudor England when Shakespeare was writing his plays, with the audience all around three sides, not much scenery, no scenery really, and no props. And there was a very interesting event on stage. At one point in the play, which the actors were wearing modern clothes, at one point in the play, an actress, one of the characters, tried to steal a wallet from a young man. And she did this by putting her arms around him, just the two actors in the middle of the stage. She put her arms around him, and as he was enjoying the embrace of the young lady, her hand went slowly down the back of his back towards his wallet that was in his hip pocket. And of course, the audience were all shouting, "Watch out, she's trying to steal your wallet. She's trying to steal your wallet." Everyone was shouting, but the young actor, the young character on stage, couldn't hear that, of course. He was enjoying the company of the lady, and she was about to draw the wallet out of his pocket when a little boy, aged about 8 or 9 years old, jumped up from the side of the stage, ran out into the middle of the stage, and pulled at the hand of the male actor. And he said, pointing at the young lady, saying, "Oh, she's trying to get your wallet. Stop, stop, he's trying to get your wallet." And that, of course, everyone collapsed in laughter. The performance came to a stop. Everyone was laughing. What that said to me was, here is a society in which stories are immensely important, and in which the theatre is immensely important. As I said, there were no props on stage. There was very little scenery. And yet, that small boy was so involved in the story that he ran out into the center of the stage. And this instantly caught my imagination. Because this kind of thing could not happen in a theatre in Australia. You can't have the audience running out onto the stage trying to interrupt the performance. It couldn't happen. There's a kind of a distance, an alienation, I suppose you could say, in the theatre as we know it in Europe and in Australia, but not in Indonesia. Theatre is very much a part of people's everyday life. So I moved to Java, and I enrolled as a student at Gajah Mada University, and I completed a degree there. And in the course of doing that degree, I became interested in the Javanese language and the literature of the Javanese language. And I found that one of the repositories, one of the places where that literature is sort of stored and transmitted, are sacred tombs. And there are a lot of these across Java. I've visited perhaps more than 100 sacred places, tombs of saints and other prominent people in Java, and listened to the stories that are told there. And as I listened to those stories, I became interested in the practice of pilgrimage, how people go to these sacred places. And so my study of pilgrimage in Java is really not really anthropological or sociological. It's not really from a religious point of view. It's from the point of view of literature. I'm interested in the way stories are kept alive and transmitted through these sacred places. And so I became very interested in Javanese. Javanese is a very unique language. And the interesting thing that we should, I think, bear in mind is that it's not a small language. It's a language with special features that are unique in the world, especially its honorific levels. And it's a language spoken by, it's somewhere between 80 and 100 million people. That's a huge language. If you look at the languages of the world in order of how many speakers they have, native speakers, Javanese comes in at around number 11, 12, 13, somewhere like that, depending how you count it. And that is bigger than most of the languages of Europe. And yet, Javanese somehow or other seems to have gone under the radar. It has a literary tradition which goes right back to the time of Borobudur, right back to the 8th, 9th century, more than 1,000 years of written literature in Javanese. That makes the Javanese literary heritage older than Malay and even older than English. I mean, if you take English to be a combination of Anglo-Saxon and French, that kind of amalgam, that appeared around the 1300s in England. Well, 400 or 500 years before that, the Javanese were already writing down their literature, and there's been a continuous tradition going right up into the present. And in fact, in the present, what really grips me is that the Javanese continue to write modern literature in the Javanese language. It sort of, again, slips under the radar, but I have in my study here at home something like between 100 and 200 new books published in the last 5 years, probably, in the Javanese language. Books, novels, short stories, etc., etc. So it's still very much alive, and that's what interests me, and that's what has grabbed my imagination. So that sort of sums it up as best I can.
Thank you, George. And there we have it, the remarks from our 3 guest writers. We have questions. We are open for questions now. And we have one coming from a Tammy K, and it is addressed to Jennifer. I will read it. How much time did you spend in Indonesia until you could write something about it? Did you come here with a mission to write? Or was it your travel here that inspired you to write? Jennifer, that's for you.
Yes, well, on the first visit, I wasn't necessarily thinking of Java as such as a site of poetry, but it developed over several visits, and it took a very long time to actually produce the book, so that I forget how many years now, over 10. During that time, I'd be doing research. I'd travel back to Indonesia, and other kinds of reading I was doing came into it. As well as that, I'd read more contemporary literature, such as Preludius and others. So the reading wasn't only about the ancient times, but I was looking at a kind of perspective as well. So it was a very long project. It took some time to get the voice right of the architect, So, I mean, it was the most wonderful project. I can't imagine not having done it now. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Will do. We'll have to do. I have other questions, and this question is addressed to all the panelists, and this is how it goes. Recent developments, it comes from Ms. Naya, and I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, Zikirina, and it's addressed to all the panelists. Recent developments have caused a lot of young people in Indonesia to have a very pessimistic view of the country. Many feel that caring for the country has become a heavy burden. As foreigners studying Indonesia, what would you say is the main strength of Indonesian people that we should focus on in these trying times? Let's start with Michael. Michael, what is your answer to this question?
You know, it's tempting to fall back. It's a very good question, and it's tempting to fall back on tradition, I suppose. You know, which Indonesia, in its formative years, was able to do, where people came together, not necessarily with strong leadership, to do things, to survive those difficult years at the end of the Dutch colonial period under the Japanese occupation, and then in the years of the struggle for independence, and people came together in different parts of the country, in different and survived and struggled together, often organizing themselves in smaller groups, not necessarily relying on leaders or organizations or organizational frameworks. And I suppose that's captured by the Indonesian phrase gotong royong. But in the modern period, I think that the emphasis of the question just now was on the problems faced by young people today, and the challenges for the younger generation, which of course in Indonesia is a big chunk of the population. And it's not like the formative years where there was the absence of government, the absence of authority, where people had to make do. Today you have the tools of social media, you have the strong constraints of law, of organizations, of the bureaucracy, and leadership that it tends to be very top down and doesn't always listen to the younger generation. And so it is I think a very big challenge for younger people in Indonesia today. And I would say that one of the things that is of course most important is to make sure that people are getting the most out of the education system, and striving to educate themselves, so that they can better cope with the challenges of today. And that's not always very easy either. In rural Indonesia, people have to travel long distances to go to school. You know, many people can't afford the textbooks. You know, there's a real socioeconomic struggle to have access to proper education. The government does a lot in terms of subsidization, in terms of making sure that there are schools, you know, that there are roads, that there's transport, but it is nonetheless still a challenge. And I think in urban areas, it's becoming increasingly difficult for young people in particular, to have access to opportunities. We're seeing in this current period a tremendous impact on the economy and on the very entrepreneurial spirit that has given a lot of young people access to opportunity, because there's going to be very little capital to provide the resources for people to establish for themselves, even in this environment where the economy is more open, and where there is more freedom than there has ever been before in Indonesia. The constraints of the pandemic are very great indeed. And so I think there will be, not just in Indonesia, but around the world for the younger generation, a tremendous amount of pain and suffering that people like myself, who's older, maybe not won't experience in quite the same way, because I'm not in the process of pioneering, launching a career, and getting on the road to responsibility. So I do feel for young people in particular at this particular moment. It's very challenging indeed. Yuli, you're mute. We can't hear you, Yuli.
Can't hear you, Yuli.
Oh, still can't hear you.
Oh, we still can't hear you, Yuli.
No. Oh, sorry, we can't hear you.
Can't hear you, Yuli.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
George, we would like to have you respond to the question on the strength of the Indonesian people. What should they focus on in these trying times?
Yes, it's a very, very difficult question to answer because, for example, the questioner talked about the pessimism of the younger generation, but it's very difficult to define pessimism and to quantify it. So I'm not quite as perhaps as negative or as pessimistic as the questioner is. Working at the Australian National University, I've noticed quite a remarkable change in the quality of the students coming from Indonesia to study with us here in Australia. 20, 30 years ago, students from Indonesia lacked confidence. They were not really very assertive. It was difficult to get students to contribute freely and critically in class. That's not the case now. Our younger students, the students who are now coming to Australia to study, are extremely self-confident, very good in English and in doing research, and they are very willing to criticize or to be critical of the views of especially of foreign scholars, but also, of course, of their own people, of their own scholars, Indonesian scholars. So I find that I have, just looking at the students who are coming here to Australia to study, the quality of those students, their confidence and their hope in the future is much, much better than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Thank you, George. Jennifer, it's your turn now to answer that question because it was addressed to all the panelists. They would like to hear from each one of you.
Yes, as the other speakers have said, it's a very difficult question. I can go on my limited experience of meeting young people in the arts, for example, in Indonesia, and I found them very engaged, very energetic and committed to various environmental and social issues, causes. I find them very inspiring, and I think that from our experience here with the pandemic and lockdown, the best things have been the connections made with people locally, so that in a way, perhaps whatever your area is, you can work together in positive ways. But it's difficult for me to comment on the pessimism others may feel from this distance, but I have seen some really exciting work, and energy from young people.
Thank you. Sorry, I was looking at. We have a few more questions. I'm trying to see from the screen. One question was for Jennifer, but it was the same one that was asked of you from Tammy. So I'm going to the other one, and this is for George. I have heard from, the question comes from Ann Ambler. I have heard that the Javanese changed their script to our alphabetical one. When was this? What effect do you think it had on the literature and the use of the language in general?
Yes, that's true. Javanese abandoned their old script, which was called Honotaroko, which is a script derived from India. That was gradually displaced around 100 years ago in the first half of the 20th century. The reasons for it are not clear. Partly, according to Dutch observers, European script was simply, or Latin script was simply more efficient and and cheaper to produce books in that script. But it's also because Javanese had noticed what's happened in some other countries, such as, for example, in Turkey, where the Arabic script was abandoned and replaced by Roman script in order to help with modernization. The same thing happened in Vietnam and in a number of other countries. And many of the many Javanese fully supported the use of Latin or Roman script instead of the old Honotaroko script, because they regarded it as more modern, and that it would, the script was used for Bahasa Indonesia. So Java also wanted to have Javanese culture to be modern and progressive in the same way that the nationalist culture of Indonesia was. So for that reason, there was an economic factor, and there was also the factor of the push for modernity. The Honotaroko script was gradually supplanted or displaced by the Roman Latin script in the first half of the 20th century. But just to add one thing, today with the advent of social media, we now have a number of sites appearing on social media which are dedicated to the revival and writing of Javanese in the old Honotaroko script, so that it's possible that sometime into the future, the impact of social media and computers and the internet may help to revive, or at least to keep alive, Honotaroko script.
Thank you. Thank you very much, George. This next question also comes from Ann Ambler, and it's addressed to Michael. Michael, many countries are becoming more polarized around economic success. Do you think that Indonesia is more likely to become polarized around religious practices rather than economic power?
It's an interesting question, and thank you for that, because the two currents, in a way, of polarization across this region, generally in Southeast Asia, are around identity and economic inequality. And the two often coincide. What we often see is marginalized people of one religion or group, ethnic group, who either because of pre-existing prejudices or because of economic marginalization become polarized in mainstream society. And I think it's fair to say that in the Indonesian context over the last decade or so, the emergence of conservative Islamic populist groups led out of some of the pesantren, the madrasas, but also, in urban areas, have relied on economic hardship and inequality to garner support, popular support, not just on the basis of dogma and religious exclusivity. I think this was very much true of Hizbut Tahrir before it was banned. I used to watch and observe Hizbut Tahrir marches across Indonesia and gatherings where the rhetoric was very much about economic hardship and inequality, as much as, if not more so, than Islamic dogma. So I think the two coincide, and that does therefore reinforce the polarization, even if it's often seen through the lens of religious exclusivity.
Thank you, Michael. I have one question addressed to all the panelists, and I would like you to give a short version as possible, given the time constraint. All of you are students of Indonesia, Indonesian culture, Indonesian society, and the question that I would like to ask is, how do you see the future of Indonesian literature in the global arena? And I'll start with Jennifer.
Yes, well, I think that it's a very exciting time for Indonesian literature. The various genre and the range of writing and the publishing possibilities seem far greater than before. And so I think the future, especially with the publicity it's had globally through the Frankfurt Book Show and London and so on, has really given it prominence, and a number of authors are becoming much better known, such as Laila Hudori and Intan Paramadita and others. So I think it's a really exciting prospect for literature.
George, what do you think?
Yes, we've seen a good number of very good translations of Indonesian literature in recent years, recent decades even, going into the international arena and being well received. So I think the future of Indonesian literature internationally is pretty good. One thing that I would regret, though, is that if Indonesian writers try to, shall we say, surf or ride on the fashions that are dominant in the international arena, because the real strength of Indonesian literature is in its indigenous traditions, in my opinion. So we've seen, we have to try to ensure that somehow or other those indigenous traditions of Indonesia are transmitted and translated into the international arena in a way that is comprehensible to the international world at large, and is simply not capitulating to the fashions that the styles and the fashions that tend to dominate in the big competitions and prizes internationally. Indonesia's real strength is in its indigenous traditions.
Thank you, George. Michael, can we hear from you?
You know, I was reflecting on this, Yuli. I've always felt that one of the most important encounters that I ever had in Indonesia was with Pramudia Nandatur, the late Pramudia Nandatur. One year I was in Hong Kong, living in Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong Literary Festival invited Pramudia to Hong Kong. And I was actually asked to help moderate the panel, but also look after him in Hong Kong on his visit. And it was one of the events that he attended was an Asia Society lunch, where Pramudia stood up in front of this audience of mainly Western and Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese bankers and financiers. And he said, he lifted his fist in a salute and he said, "The revolution is coming. You know, all you Western capitalists, you know, have ripped off the world, and I'm telling you that the struggle has only just begun." What was a remarkable tour de force, and he was doing it very cheekily and on purpose. And I also discovered that when he arrived in Hong Kong, all these Indonesian Chinese who'd fled to Hong Kong over the years after the mid-1960s came out to visit him. And so that was the real power of Indonesian literature, but not just that. Pramudia is a figure, a political figure. And I'm reminded of an article that he wrote in the New York Times a few years ago about Deka, Mutatuli, and the great novel that, in his words, ended colonialism in Indonesia. There was a Dutch writer who wrote Max Havelaar, which is an impossible to read novel, by the way. And I think that it's really just not just Indonesian literature and traditions, but the power of ideas. And I think that's what he was trying to say in that article, very generous article about Mutatuli, that it's not just what you say about your country, but about the power of ideas. And I think we've yet to see someone really emerge of the same stature of Pramudia. And what I would like to see and anticipate is that at some point there's a revisiting of Pramudia's legacy and what he had to offer in terms of ideas, not just on Indonesia, but for the rest of the world.
Agreed. Thank you, Michael. Well, time is up and we could go on and on. So I would like to thank very much our panelists for sharing their views with us, for taking time. I would especially like to thank our viewers, wherever you are, for joining our panel. Please continue following the programs and activities of the Lontar Foundation and help us help Indonesian writers and poets. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuli.
Thank you, Yuli. Terima kasih.
Yes, thank you, Michael.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, bye.